So, welcome to another episode of Coming to Your Senses, where we talk about navigating the labyrinth of the mind and emerging victorious. Now, over the last 25 years, I genuinely have lost count of the amount of courses and trainings and things that I've been on. And I probably couldn't recount to you exactly not only what they were, but what I took away from them from a course content. But I can guarantee that pretty much every course I've been on, I have walked away with somebody that I've stayed in contact with in some way, shape, or form. And my guest today is absolutely one of those people who I met in, believe it or not, 2008 in India. And I do not know where she's got so much that I know she could talk about today. So I don't know where we're going to go with our conversation. But before we even launch into any of the questions, welcome, Wendy. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Jules. It's been fabulous to have known you since 2008. I've loved our connection, and I'm just so pleased to be here, and I'm excited to see what comes out of our conversation today.
Yeah, me too, me too. So I will open up with my usual question, which is, can you tell me or tell us a time where you have come to your senses and where and what that led you to?
Yes. So I think my initial I feel like I've come to my senses on numerous occasions.
Yeah.
But the one that was a real like bam, like there's definitely something else was for me quite a very catastrophic event. Actually, back in 2001, when I had an emergency caesarean section with my youngest daughter. She was born 8 weeks early, and I ended up contracting necrotising fasciitis, more commonly known as the flesh-eating disease, that got into my womb and ovaries and just started to spread in my body. And it's a horrific thing. I mean, apparently you can actually see it spread. The skin turns black. Necrotising fasciitis is literally death of the tissue. And the surgeons have no choice but to remove that diseased flesh in an attempt to save lives, which is what they did with me. So they removed about 2/3 of the flesh on the front of my torso, along with my womb and ovaries, and then put me into a medical coma in an attempt to save my life. And at some point in that coma, I had a near death experience. So all of a sudden, I was outside of my body. And the weirdest thing was, and you'll know it too, Jules, and I'm sure your listeners will as well, that part of you which is unchanged, which you've always known, it doesn't matter what age you are, it feels the same. I think I had an inkling that day that I feel that's our soul, because I was aware of myself. I was aware of that part of myself, but I knew I wasn't in my physical body. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm not my body, was the first thought. And then there was just this incredible light, and there was like a momentum into it, like a pulling me into it and towards it. And I was just quite happily going. It was just the most beautiful, blissful thing. Words will never do it justice. I had no thought for this physical world. When all of a sudden there was a tug on my arm, and I looked back, and it was my husband. And I sort of tried to move him again because I really wanted to go, and I really wanted him to come with me. And I could see forms taking shape ahead of me. And I just heard telepathically, if you come, you must come on your own. And I so wanted to go. It was just so blissful. I tried to pull him again, but he wouldn't budge. And the same thing telepathically, if you come, you must come on your own. And I didn't want to leave him. And that thought, actually, that momentum subsided, and I came back into my body. So that for me was a huge coming to the senses, as in almost expanded senses, that there definitely is something else beyond what I had previously known there to be. This incredible love, this incredible was love. That's it, just this pure wisdom, this pure unconditional love.
And when you came out of the coma, how much of that experience did you recall? Because the thing that I find fascinating about anyone that I've either listened to or had a personal conversation with that's had a near death experience is the commonality of how things are described. And love is definitely love and light, the physicality of experiencing a light, and the sensations around that. But love is definitely a phrase or a word that is talked about as not conceptually but experientially. And I'm curious as to how much you were aware of when you came out of that coma, and what that then led you onto, because obviously I just can't even comprehend having had a premature child, then having a medical emergency, and then going into a coma. I don't know how much awareness is happening at that point, 'cause it's not something I've experienced, having a near death experience, and then waking up back in this world. I mean, just a few things happening all at once. Um, how much of that were you aware of as you were coming around?
Yeah, it has always remained a very vivid memory or experience. It's different to like a dream, or even because it really is, like you said it really beautifully actually when you said it's an experiential thing. It's not an intellectual thing, it's an experiential thing. And so that element was really vivid. Yet also then, like you also said, there were all these other things going on, and I got plunged back into physicality and the trauma in the body, the discomfort, the pain. The thankfully my daughter had she didn't struggle at all, even though she was 8 weeks premature. She hadn't struggled at all, but she was in the special care baby unit, and I'm in the intensive care unit. So I can't. It must have been so difficult for my mum was there, and my husband must have been so hard for them and our immediate family. And so there was this real contrast, actually, incredible contrast between suffering and peace. And I have to say, coming back into the physicality, it is the suffering that took over initially. And what I will say now, my daughter's 23 now. So all these years later, what I can say is like, I wouldn't change a thing. But at the time, I absolutely would have changed everything. I would not have chosen to go through it. And it was hard. It was really hard coming back into the disfigurement of the body. I hated it, the discomfort, the procedures too. Like, I lost so much flesh on my torso. It was like, would I even sit up? Like, I was basically flat on my back for 3 months in the hospital, and just not knowing what life would be like and how life would be. Um, Yet this sense of this something else. And I immediately told my mum about it, and I told my husband about it, and I spoke to my sisters about it, that I'd had this amazing experience of being in the light. And I think the interesting thing then was the things that began to happen after that, because if it's like it opened the doorway to something, and then those experiences continue to come. And I think that's what's allowed it to become more of an experiential lived experience over the years. And I think the body is such an integral part of that for us all. I think that my passion actually, and that even is like the first kind of message I had, it was really about how do we live, how do we live this human experience in a way, because it really felt like this was a gift to be lived, not this awful suffering to overcome, which I think had been my take on life before. It's like, life is a struggle, and then eventually we're released into heaven, which is kind of what we're told through many religions, isn't it? And I think there's this wonderful awakening coming, this return to union, where we're realizing, oh wow, we can live this right now. This sense of the divine, this sense of something greater, this love as well, this pure love instead of the love of conditions that we often live as human beings. And I think that's what it really gave me. I think the key word actually, which is coming out today, is contrast. A contrast between like I thought I knew what love was, and I had no idea. What I thought love was not what love is at all. And a love of conditions, and a love of like an emptiness that needed to be filled, as opposed to the fact that this love dwells within us all, and is something which is just there all the time. Yet there's kind of a veil over it in some ways.
And I think even just saying the word, sometimes I'm hesitant to use the word because there's so many descriptors around what love is, and yet I certainly haven't experienced what I'm assuming you're describing. But what I notice is that love is so it's got so many meanings from a psychological perspective that's been attached to it and weighting it down. And yet, when it's genuinely experienced, then there's no way of describing it. There's no way of really articulating it because it is such an experiential moment. What came to mind as you were talking, I was delivering a workshop last week, and one of the exercises that I got the delegates to do was, initially I got them to describe from a psychological perspective what confidence is, give all the meanings and the understanding of what it is, and then I took them through this little process, which was basically getting them into their bodies of experiencing, and what was it like to experience it those times. And then they were discussing it with their partners, and afterwards I said to them, well, what was the difference? And every single one was going, I want the second. I thought I was looking for the first, what all these constructs of what it is, but actually what I'm looking for is the experience. And I think that how I perceive what you're describing is all the conditioning, all the thinking that we have around what love is, and actually what you experience, they're completely different. And yet, how do you explain something that's kind of inexplainable?
Yeah, and probably like different aspects too. They set up there to be like 4 different types of love. So, what we're talking about here in that pure unconditional love is what they would call agape love, isn't it? That love of, God, source, the universe, whatever you call it, that pure unconditional love is agape love. And then, there's said to be, the love of, a parent for a child, the love of friendship, kinship, and eros, that romantic love. And, they're different qualities. And I think what's interesting is in the sort of the parental or the friendship, kinship, or the eros, is like there's some kind of conditions around those. They are love, but they're a conditional love. Whereas the agape love we're talking about is a purely unconditional love. It has no judgment, it doesn't condemn, it doesn't require anything. It's just this incredible, incredible love. And it's not an intellectually experienced thing, like you beautifully said about the confidence. We can, if we're living in the intellect and we're living in thought and the psychology of what something is, it's very different to the embodied experience. And so, I think many of us, and I certainly know I was, like a head on a stick, very much in my mind, very much that, I've got to think my way through life. That's what life is. It's thought, and not, not in the body. And, for me, this experience, was a real plonking in the body, actually, through, because what I also came to realize afterwards was like, wow, that actually the discord in myself was the root of the disease. So very interestingly, 2 years before I contracted necrotising fasciitis, I'd gone for a tarot card reading, and I wasn't big into those kinds of things, but I was a bit lost at what I should do at a point in my life. And there was a wonderful lady at work who was like well outside of anything that I would have conceived. She had crystals around her computer, and that for me at that time was like well out there, And I was just saying to her, I don't know what to do about this thing. And she said, oh, I know this amazing tarot card woman, like she's brilliant, why don't you go and have a reading? I was like, oh, well, all right, then I've got nothing to lose. And she didn't answer my question I had that was my life question at that point in time. But at one point, she indicated my lower abdomen, this woman, and she said, you've got a dark area there. She said, it's mother issues, and if you don't sort it out, you'll be ill. And it went right over my head because I had no sense of energy or the fact that, things manifested into the body. And then I thought, 2 years later, when I end up losing my womb and ovaries, I mean, you can't get more mother issues than that, can you? Manifested in form. And at the time, I remember thinking, oh, well, my mum's, there's odd things with my mum, but, she's not that bad. And what I realized afterwards is, oh, it's not like my mum. It's like the mother, like divine feminine energy, and the dismissal and the denial of that in our lives, which I think is, what the world is struggling with so much at the moment, is the missing, of that energy. And that where everything is vibrational and it comes into form and experience, that if we don't have, the balance of masculine and feminine, we move off and we come more into fear rather than love then. And what we get then is separation and division and all of the, many of the things that we are experiencing right now, which is not working for people, for any of us, men or women. It's not a feminine thing or a female thing. It feels like the divine union of energies, you know?
And the word that comes to mind is alignment and being out of alignment. And a word that you used when you were describing your experience was suffering. And I think that being a head on a stick is we're so caught up in the descriptions of how we perceive things should be. So I think that you and I are of a similar generation and were brought up with how a woman should be, and that actually this feminine energy stuff, which wasn't really spoken about, but anything that was about that way of being was shoved in the back of the cupboard and don't come out, lock it, put the bookcase in front of it. And interestingly enough, as I've reached postmenopause, I did a ceremony for myself of literally just writing a letter to my 9-year-old self, which was the age which I started the menstrual cycle. And at that point, it was the scariest thing on the planet because I didn't even know it existed, let alone then experiencing something. And what I then heard was both my aunt and my mum say she's got the curse of being a woman. Now, as a woman, I understand the euphemism of that. I understand what it was pointing to. But as a 9-year-old, I heard that as a curse, as something was wrong with me. And so anything that came in my direction about being feminine or being a woman was just shove it away. Don't want it, don't want it, don't want it. And it's taken decades to really see that and start to relax into that and become aware of that misalignment. And I think that there's so much my brain's going, ask her about this, ask her about that. There's so many wonderful things that you said, but I think I do want to pick up on the word suffering and link it to your challenges that you had with your body afterwards, because so many women in particular don't like their bodies for varying reasons, and having suffering about that rather than having with being what is. I'm curious as to how you came to be so comfortable with that, because when I met you and I remember having a discussion about it, my recollection is you did this wonderful story about a shark attack and that you'd had a shark attack, and you started giggling about it all and then actually explained what had happened. But you made it, I don't know if it was a cover up or whether it was a way to make it easier for somebody seeing the scars that you've got. I don't know, but how did you come into alignment with the transformations of your body?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a lovely question. It took a long time, and I didn't like my body before. I think, like many women, we're, oh God, I mean, we could just talk for hours, couldn't we, about women? But the ideas that we're fed as kids, models, and I remember part of my exploration, I did a psychology degree, and I remember just being astounded how, like, many of the photographs that we see, the images that we see of models, is like they're Photoshop where legs are made to look longer, torsos are extended. So we're not actually even seeing real physical people, and then we're wanting to live up to that image. It's just insane. So much insanity, in the psyche, really. And but our own bodies then, yeah, because I'm familiar, I always remember hating my thighs and thinking they were too big. I always wanted to be thinner. I wanted my stomach to be flat, all of these things. And, and then to be faced with this incredible disfigurement, was quite a thing. And initially, I'm very pleased I did have him at the beginning. I had a very maverick plastic surgeon, and I'm very grateful for him, because I think if I hadn't had him, if I'd had a more conservative plastic surgeon, they may well have looked at my body and go, there's nothing we can do, in which case I would have died. So I'm incredibly grateful that he was like, right, okay, let's just see what we can do. We just have to, I mean, I'm laughing, but it is insane. Like, when I first saw the pictures of my body, because basically they removed the flesh and then they took a photograph. And when I first saw that, which was some years later, I was like, oh my gosh, like, how did I even survive that? Because it's like a slab of meat, which, we're animals, aren't we, if we get very basic about it. And it's like it's just had a chunk cut out of it. And so obviously, these incredible medical people and the things that they can do. But see that initially, and then they took skin from my thighs to graft, my sides and everything. And I think what it did is, what I can see now is, it moved my perception of myself from the outside to the inside. Because if I was still fixated on the outside of the physicality of what I look like, I would probably not be happy with my body. But I don't see it that way anymore. I actually experience it from the inside. And actually, what a miraculous thing all of our bodies are. Actually, I always think, wow, if we take a moment, and instead of thinking about the exterior visual that we're comparing to something else, and we just think about how miraculous the body is to maintain aliveness through homeostasis, which is the balance of the body, if anybody doesn't know that. But your heart beating, you're breathing in the oxygen, that being transformed in the body to go into the blood and go around to all the organs, and everything that happens without you even giving it a thought is just mind-blowingly brilliant. And I think through the healing journey as well, I think seeing what my body did to heal, and actually how it flattened out areas that were like chunks, that they became flat, and and that was like pressure garments and stuff. So there was medical and assistance, but it's just amazing what the
Yeah.
body can do. And 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 just this, yeah, like a reverence, a respect that's come over the years. And things like, I was saying to somebody just the other day, actually, on the top of my right thigh, it still has a slight wedgy bit, and it always used to bother me, and I used to wish it was like smooth. And one day my husband was just rubbing it, and he just said, "Oh, I love that bit, it's so soft." And I looked at him a bit shocked, but I remember going, I'm going to look at it like that. Instead of, oh, there's this wedgy bit, it was like, oh yeah, this bit, it is incredibly soft. And I remember my niece actually all of a sudden one day, because there's all torso scarring, but I also had septicemia, which is blood poisoning. So then I also that took a lot of damage to my feet. I lost toe tips, instep, which then I'm very flat-footed, and scars up my legs where there were literally kind of holes, in my legs. And I remember her just going, oh, I love scars. And again, I remember looking at her thinking, like, really? So all these different perspectives of things. But I think very much what it's moved me to is that an inside perception of self instead of an external perception of self. And I think when we come to an internal perception of self, we start to open up what we would call the soul or the divine self. It feels like the external perception of self, we could call it like a little else S self, is the personality, the constructed idea. Like you touched on it briefly earlier, actually, like, who should we be? How should we be? What should we look like? What do we have to conform to? All of this fitting in thing is very exterior instead of the internal, which is where we get all the gold, because I do believe each person is kind of uniquely crafted with talents, and those are dwelling inside of us. And that also is our connection to source, that thing which is greater, our soul self. And as we get to experience more of that, we're more in the moment, and we're more in the embodied experience of being a human, rather than in the mental construct, the idea of this human experience. So I think there's really something between the experiential and the remembered, all the thoughts.
Yeah, and I think that it's very easy to, because of the way the artistry of thinking and the thinking mind, and how it can simulate something so much, that actually we think that what we're experiencing is real versus a true experience. And I think there can seem like such a fine line between the two, but when you really start to notice the difference, it's like, I often talk about. I used to work in Scarborough many years ago, and on the seafront there was one of these simulator capsule things that you went and sat in. There's only about 12 of you in there. You sat in rows, put seatbelts on, and a big screen in front of you, and all of a sudden it went plunged into darkness, and then the screen came on, and you're at the top of a roller coaster. And of course, all it is a box on hydraulics. That is all it is. And it's going up and it's moving and all of this. And course, the majority of us are in there. I can't remember what else they did. I think you were on a plane and it was looping the loop and all sorts of things like this. But what it was doing was convincing the thinking mind that you were having those experiences. But I remember at one point, and I did go on this thing many, many times because I lived in Scarborough and often got bored of a Sunday. So that's where I headed. But I remember, I don't know how many times I'd been on it before I finally clocked, this is not real. If I really want to have a fun experience, then absolutely buy into the simulation. But don't confuse the simulation with the real experience of being on a roller coaster or being on a plane that's looping the loop. They are not the same thing. And I think that whether we're talking about how we're showing up in the external world and the comparisons that we're making and arguing with what is, I think, is one of the biggest things that we get caught up in, whether that's about our bodies or what we do or don't have or any of those things. Is just being with what is, being with what is there and experiencing it and then making decisions in that moment. I think we seem to be so disconnected from that. And what I'm curious about is that as you have, because obviously this experience was 23 years ago, you have done many, many things since then. What would you say were the biggest things that helped you through that experience, but then things that you've sort of sustained a practice of or of still continue looking into that's helping you to, I'm going to refer to it as living an aligned life, but that's maybe not the words that you would use. But what is it that that's really that's helped you and then you've continued that practice with?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to actually just reflect back and add to a couple of things you said, because you said some really juicy stuff there. Is that I realized I went off course and told half the story. This maverick surgeon, I remember what I was going to say about him was, I remember him coming to me when I first actually looked at my body. It took a long time to even look at it. They would change, it was all dressed, and they'd roll me in the bed and change the dressings. And then one day I thought, I need to kind of look and see what I'm dealing with. And I remember looking down and just seeing this like red, angry kind of flesh, and it just looked hideous, right? And I'd been crying about it. And he came in, and he was brilliant because I loved his honesty. He said, "What are the red eyes about?" And I said, "It's horrendous. Like, I've looked at my body, it's horrendous." And he went, "Yep." He said, "It's the worst thing you'll ever see." Which, for starters, I didn't expect him to say that. I thought he'd say, "Oh, that's not so bad." And then he said, "Yep." He said, "It's the most horrendous thing you'll ever see." He said, "But we can do reconstructive surgery and you'll end up with a smiley scar." So what he was saying was, we'll stretch the skin on your back and then we'll take off the grafts and we'll move the skin around, and you'll end up with this smiley scar. And so for a long time, I wasn't with what was. I was holding in my mind, oh, it will be a nice, neat, like the mind, like lovely, neat, smiley scar, which was never going to happen, ever, right? Even if I had reconstructive surgery, it would never have been a neat, smiley scar because of the other stuff that I was unaware of at that point. And but what happened then was, as I started to do the reconstructive surgery some like 6 months or whatever later, the first thing was that surgeon had moved on and I had a different surgeon, and I had to have a piece of my thigh over my stomach where I'd lost so much flesh on my torso that in order to give me the ability to sit and stand, etc., I had a piece of pig skin that went in to replace the bit that was, even missing from holding my intestines in place. And then they took a piece of my thigh, and they do think it's very clever. They do call it a flap, so it stays attached, but they literally move it from your thigh and turn it up and then put it over your stomach. Very, very clever surgery, right? But for me, it was way bigger than I thought it was going to be. I then had this huge, scar on my leg as well that I hadn't had before. And, it was just like more scarring. And so they did the bit on my leg, which went pretty well. And then when it came to doing anything on the torso, where I lost so much flesh and that my grafted skin then is so close to my bowel, this surgeon, he said to me, "I don't want to do it." He said, "Because I'm so concerned that as we remove the graft, we're going to like end up nicking the bowel or something like that. And then you're going to end up with bowel issues, right?" And I remember thinking, I really don't want that, because for a long time when I was in hospital, I had that a part of my bowel was actually out like for a month or so, which apparently is unheard of, that survived. So that was a miracle in itself, and that it went back in, and that I didn't end up having to have an ileostomy bag or anything like that, because my bowel had perforated when I was ill through the septicemia. So the fact that my bowel was functioning normally was a miracle, really. And I remember thinking, like, this is like risky surgery, and I really think I've had enough surgery. And I remember that day, that was the what is day, because I remember breaking down completely and then having okay, like, this is what you have to live with. This is how it is. This is what you have to come to terms with. And that is how it's going to be for the rest of your life. And that actually, like you said, the minute you stop arguing with life and what is actually happening, there was, pretty quickly actually an easing into that, because I was with what is instead of what I wanted it to be instead. And I think that really was probably a significant turning point in that journey of coming in, and being with the body, and finding peace in that. And actually that brought me more in as well. And I think, then to answer the question you just asked me, actually, that like our experience in India, that was a profound turning point for me, because what we were looking at was emotional processing, and actually coming out of the intellect and into the feeling space and into the body, and not thinking so much and analyzing, but instead just allowing the feelings, being with what is, breathing, and being with the discomfort in the body, be that often usually emotional sensations. And through that experience, for me, there was just the most divine opening up of source itself speaking to me and bringing me peace. And not just around the physicality, but then the stories of life that we're telling that limit us. Like, I remember one of them being, I will share this story to put it in context. So in our it was a silent process, wasn't it? And they said, if you don't have to think or connect outside of yourself, don't stay within yourself as much as you can. So it wasn't even speaking to each other, or certainly like don't message your family if you don't have to. And I just got together with somebody, an intimate relationship, just before I'd come away, and so I really wanted to message him. And so I'd sent him a couple of messages, and I was with another friend as well. And that friend said to me at one point, she said, oh, don't kind of like, don't shoot the messenger. She said, but why do you feel the need to message him? And it was like she punched me in the solar plexus. I remember like feeling really churny and uncomfortable. And I didn't say anything. I just walked away, but I did what we were being taught, which was like, don't overthink it. Just be with the feelings and see what happens, and breathe. And so I just was so uncomfortable. I remember going down to the meditation hall. We were on a break at that point, and going in there, and I just felt awful in my body, but I just kept breathing, and I kept just feeling awful and just breathing and being with it. And then all of a sudden, this little voice inside said, well, you've been insecure in every other relationship. Why should this one be any different? And it was so gentle, and it was so loving, and I didn't feel bad, that I was, and I just saw it. It was like, wow, yeah, I've always been insecure. And the weirdest thing is, I would not have thought before, I wouldn't have labeled myself like that. In that moment, it was so obvious that I'd been desperately seeking, for the person that was going to make me feel all right, which totally, fits with my childhood abandonment issues and the wounding from my parents and stuff, And I was like, oh my God, it was so obvious. And it made me giggle. I just started giggling, seeing this insecurity with utter love. Actually, it was that agape love, that love of it, that non-judgmental space. And everything kind of opened up. And then the weirdest thing was, I remember going back to our dormitory later, and I really couldn't be bothered to text him, because I'd actually had to go out of the dormitory, go and find another building, go up the steps, get to the roof, wave my phone around, because the reception.
Try and get a signal.
Wave my phone around to get reception. It was quite a palaver, right? And I thought, oh, it's fine. Like, he'll be fine. Is all fine. Whereas prior to that, my cognitive stuff had been like, is he worried about you? You better message him, or he's going to, be thinking something, or he's going to be waiting for you, or you're waiting for him. Do you know what I mean? There's so much mental noise that is just really coming out of our own stories. That's what I really started to see. And that's what I've seen more over the years. Basically, it feels like we are all telling a story that is our version of the world, coming out of our experiences. You alluded to it earlier, like that subjective reality. I think I'm seeing reality of life, but I never am. I'm only seeing what is coming through my own lenses and filters. And the minute I can really start to realize that, then that seems to open up a curiosity where I can hear then other people's experiences that are outside of my own and be interested in them, as opposed to thinking that's wrong. Do you know what I mean? And that we open up then to this plethora, this smorgasbord of creation and possibility. And then that feels like that's when we really get to start to choose. Because if nothing's right or wrong, there's just contrast, then we start to get to choose. Okay, what am I choosing then? And then I also think the more we come out of so the embodiment has been essential. The emotional processing has been essential. And then also from an intellectual space, because, I was a clever kid and I used cleverness to feel like I was enough. And then to start letting go of that the answers are not there, actually, that there's much more in the presence. And the intellect is beautiful, but it's a wonderful tool to be used. It's not who we truly are. And that whole, allowing more beingness, more presence, and more heart. I think, like really coming from being a head on a stick to much more heart based, and trusting and allowing that, because I think it's so hard to be heart based, because you look out at the world and it's not how we're functioning in our Western world anyway, and not just our Western world. I spoke to somebody recently actually who's Swedish, and I thought, wow, I've really got to stop saying Western, because they're Western and like they're really much more inclusive and softer. So I think it's like the UK and the US, really, that kind of individualistic approach instead of a holistic and collective approach. I think that's where our biggest conflict is right now, I think.
Yeah, because I think we're doing is we've been conditioned and trained into look for who you are and your specialism or your niche or your uniqueness, and it being amplified, your identity.
Yeah,
But and interestingly enough, I think that's right, but not in comparison to anybody else and not in conflict with anybody else, because it's it's becoming curious about what is it that how is it that I see the world, how is it that I'm experiencing the world, what impacts that having on me, and let me understand it from your point of view as well.
agree.
There's a guy, I can't think of his surname. Daryl is his first name. He's a musician, big black musician, and he just couldn't understand the Ku Klux Klan. Could
Oh,
not understand.
yes, yes, and yes.
I can't think of his surname, but anyway, and just thought, how can you hate somebody that you don't know?
Yes.
And so just got curious and ended up having a meeting with one of the heads of, and was just genuinely, I'm not here to stop you being a member of it. I want to understand you. That's all I want to understand. But because he was willing to have that conversation, members after members after members, once they got to know him, because all of a sudden they were inviting him to meetings and they were inviting him to stuff because they're like, oh no, he's a good guy, bring him in. And of
Yeah,
course, once they got to know him and they realizing that they're friends with a black man, then it's like, well, how can I be part of this thing that's anti that? And I think that is in so much of our everyday life, whether it's, there were 20 women on the workshop last week, and they openly admitted, and interesting enough, they were in Switzerland, and I have to say it's one of the friendliest countries I've ever been to. So they are very open and they are very inclusive, and yet they said that they knew that the biggest enemies that they face every day were two: is one, that them and they're thinking about them, but how they think and how they treat other women.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I thought that was a really honest and a really astute thing to say. And I said, well, we were talking about, well, what would it be like to truly appreciate who and how you are and who and how they are, even if they're completely opposite, even if you don't agree. You don't, to understand somebody isn't about agreeing. And I think that, with what you're saying there, it's the same. If we did that internally, then we will automatically start to do it externally. But I
Oh,
think that
yeah, yeah,
so many of us are fighting with that as an external thing.
yeah.
But if we've got to do it internally first. And I think, that's what I love that. I don't know if it's a paradox or an irony that for you to fall in love with your body, you first of all had to have a near death experience. which enabled you to see that you are not your body, but to then come back into it and it be changed beyond your comprehension and have to go through such a significant amount of healing in order for you to be with how it is now.
Yeah, and I think it's the coming in too as well. I think it, like for all of us, not just me. I think it's the coming into the body, into the experience with each other. Like you said about that amazing guy Daryl, I love that story, and I love how he even is like godfather, isn't he, to one of the like head
Yeah, yeah.
like kid. Do you know what I mean? Like they made such a friendship. But what it caused is it caused them to question, didn't it, the conditioning that had been passed down to them. And I think there is so much, isn't it, where you see these conflicts which arise and re-arise and re-arise. And like the people that where it began, like no one is alive anymore. And yet these conflicts are still arising because the conditioning is being passed on. And if we can bring in something different where we're not just living in our own train tracks of our own culture or society or family story, and we're instead then getting into that experience with each other, then we get a whole different experience arises. And also that it's not just even with each other, it's also with our own self, because it's like the conditioning is, we could think of like the intellect is in the intellect, but the intellect is that wisdom is also in the body. So we're conditioned in the body. So we will, for example, you see it all the time, don't you, where we unconsciously keep away from ourselves the very thing we want. So for example, somebody may want an intimate relationship, but they've been hurt, so their heart is closed, so they're terrified of being hurt again, so they don't open up, so they can't have the intimate relationship that they want. That's unconscious. It's not even conscious, because we'll have like, I've been on all these dates, like, why does nobody, but what we're not realizing is, wow, it's in me, it's in me, it's in me. So this perpetual opening, and I love it. I've been doing, so the embodiment has been like huge for me over the years. I did a shiatsu training first, where I really sort of started to learn about energy and energy of the body. And then, Tai Chi, Qigong, things like that in the body, yoga. And then in the last year, I've been doing this incredible embodiment training, which I absolutely love. And to do that with women is just like the most delicious thing, because you get then in the body this experience of union and connection. You cannot think your way to it, but through your physicality, you can experience your way to it. And I just had my final, so I've been doing this for a year, and like we're now in like training mode, like being out in the world doing it, which is amazing. And I've just had a weekend this weekend of it, and we did this amazing like flowing and moving around the room and just connecting for a moment with somebody, eye to eye, heart to heart. You can just feel it, and then just flowing off and connecting with someone else. So there's like 30 of us in the room. But then you get this experience of that flow, that divineness, that wholeness, that as an embodied experience, and then that's what like changes it then, because then in your cells, you know of the truth of it, of, as opposed to when we're the heads on the sticks, that is in separation, it isn't in union. So yeah, it's the most delicious work. So I'm so excited to be, coming out more of that, and you can do your couples, but for me, I'm going to be starting with women, because I feel so, I know how uncomfortable I used to feel in my body. I know how I sexually gave my body away way too well. It got taken from me way too early, and then of course I just gave it because it didn't have the value, and or I didn't value it, and so, and the pain that causes, actually, then those wounds. And again, I don't believe that you can really think your way to that either, but you can certainly feel your way to that when you're willing. And then all of that stuff which is held, it can be released, and then it gets filled up then actually with the divinity instead of the suffering. And then you're in the beauty of woman, the divine feminine of woman. The boundaries are easy, for example, the union is easy, because there's an honoring of the self. And I think, that's a wound that we can see that runs really deep, and it's been born of, many different religions, hasn't it? And the taking out of the feminine, from the sacred, that actually I think, wow, as women, although it's been hard, like the beauty is right now, we get to be creating and beginning to bring into beings the lived experience of something else. And that is a pretty freaking cool time to be alive, I think.
I think it's a pretty freaking cool time to be alive. Absolutely. Absolutely. I love this conversation, and there's so many different questions and different aspects of what you're talking about. So maybe there's a part two to this at some point. But what I would love to leave our listeners with is, what are those, over the years, you and I have both been sort of seeking, practicing, exploring for, 20, 25 years. What are the commonalities? What are the practices that you continue to do to help you navigate through life's chaos and help you maintain a level of clarity and awareness?
Yeah, thank you. Nature, definitely, space and time. Like daily space, actually, because again, in our busy, like you got to be doing, haven't you? And it's like, no, let's stop doing that. So for me, there is, yeah, daily space, and particularly, daily time in nature that, and like, not going with a podcast, not going in silence, in that quiet, to just be. And I think, if you struggle with meditation, to just go out for a walk in your presence with nature is such a wonderful way to bring that sense of peace, which is what we're seeking through meditation, right? Many ways to it. So that definitely, for me, the continued journey from my head to my heart, and that is helped hugely, like through the embodiment work. So, and anything where you're, yeah, really being in your body and listening to your body and allowing what's in your body, and if you're moving and there's some tears, just let them fall. Don't make a big deal out of them, as in, like, don't go into your head and try and analyze it. Just be, and then everything kind of moves. So that's very delicious. And I also think really connecting with other women. I used to very much be a loner, and I used to hate groups of women. So it
Me
intrigues me
too.
now that my favourite
Me
space to be
too.
is in a group of women, and I used to be much more comfortable with men. And actually, I so love being with women, and that, and again, that deepening of that all the time, because it's that anything we can do to get it into the body, is when we truly get that profound transformation. Transformation is not an intellectual pursuit, is it? It's an experiential pursuit, isn't it? And then there's revelation. And I think for me also then a daily and ongoing surrender to that which is greater. I've had a lot of blocks to that, because I had a lot of blocks because of religion. I don't come from a religious background, and my whole kind of thinking was, wow, that just seems to have caused a lot of wars and a lot of suffering. And so, yeah, for me, an ongoing surrender to the divine, which, yeah, is the only thing that makes me truly happy. when I get to in my head, and I'm not with that, I realize I've gone off course. Like you were saying, that alignment, to me, that alignment comes from, really being with that, and with that in the present moment, and to allow that. And I think as well, for me, there was like a big block, because it sort of felt like, oh, religion has got a monopoly on spirituality, and I was like, really has it? But it kind of sort of has in the story. But no, we can have that, and we don't have to be religious. And, that it's more that, yeah, not a non-religious, spirituality. And also where it goes too far, for me personally, like too far sometimes the other way, into a whole load of stuff. I'm like, wow, I don't get that either. So this, I think the divinity is within each and every one of us has a personal connection with it, rather than someone else has got it and you haven't, or someone else could tell you and you haven't. So I think, yeah, the practicing of those things, which really is, it is, mind, body, spirit, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the breakthrough for me, because I can relate to what you're saying from a religion perspective, was it's just the word life. That it's life. It's life within us. It's life that produces the flower and the trees, and it's the same thing that heals us. It's the same thing that functions this body. So for me, that was a word that made it a lot easier to just go, yeah, the thing that's bigger than the thinking, the thing that I can connect with, that feels accessible, rather than the universe, which just seemed too big, and God had too many connotations, but life I could access. So that's been
Yeah, and I
my...
think for me there has been a surrendering into God. Actually, I came across the word. I've been listening to Revelations of the Aramaic Jesus recently, and it has just been so delightful, because It's Neil Douglas Klotz, and he has spent his lifetime actually translating from the Aramaic. So he's written several books in the last 35 years. And I only came across it recently, but it's so beautiful because he just or he'll say there's a slight misunderstanding here. He is the actual interpretation. So even like, Our Father who art in heaven in the Lord's Prayer, the beginning of that actually in Aramaic is Dabun. And Dabun is actually Abba, Father, and Woon, womb, the feminine. It's the combination of the union of the two. It's not a masculine thing, which, our religion has certainly been a masculine thing, hasn't it? The British religion. And also that I think the more that we understand, that the scriptures have come filtered through humans, particularly like the Romans, who then bought, okay, here's the scriptures that we will accept because this is the religion that the people will have. It's missing its source. And so, I think there, and I like the God there is Alacha is God. So for me, there's something in those words as well that God for me sits in my conditioned boxes. There's a lot of unconscious resistance to it in my conditioned boxes. Yet for me personally, because having glimpsed what I would call God in my near-death experience, that pure, infinite, unconditional love, and then I began to question that actually when I was doing my psychology degree. I began to question it because I was like, maybe one of the theories is this near-death experience is just something the brain does at that point in time. And I thought, oh, maybe it was. And then I was doing a Tai Chi retreat. And I'd also thought, well, I was on a cocktail of drugs, like who knows else what was going on in my body at that point of breakdown. But some years later, I was doing a Tai Chi retreat, no drugs, perfectly, just some couscous and salad for my lunch. And we did this exercise with a tree. And as I closed my eyes and connected with this tree, I again lost all sense of my separate self. And I met that same love, that same feeling that I did in the near-death experience. And the words for it there were unconditional love. And there was an absolute certainty. Everything comes from it and everything returns to it. So, what you're saying is that life, the only thing I would say with life is just get it big enough, because again, life, we can think of life as being, our human, and it's like, no, if we're talking about this.
Oh, no, I'm talking about the all-encompassing everything.
Cosmic, all-encompassing, infinite thing, which is so incredibly clever and intelligent, isn't it? And that. So for me, there's an ongoing surrender to that. And when I feel with that is definitely like my happiest times. And when I don't, I realize, oh, hang on, I've stopped doing my kind of spiritually connecting stuff. Yeah.
I love all of that, Wendy, and I love you. I'm extremely grateful for you sharing what you've shared today. I think there is an immense amount of richness, and there's so many threads that I would love to pull on. So maybe we need to book in a part 2 to do at some point.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for gifting your story, for gifting your insights, and for gifting us your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, and thank you, Jules. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for everything you're sharing and all the wisdom that you're sharing with everybody as well. And thank you for listening.